4 years ago, a mob of angry protesters were clashing with police in a massive government building. The ornate columns of the Capitol building were surrounded by angry men and women wearing Make America Great Again hats. Many of the protesters were armed.
You policemen are on power!
Some were carrying nooses and signs accusing the government of treason. But this isn't quite what it appears. I went to that building. These marble columns are fake. The marble cladding on the walls, that's wood, painted to look like marble. These protesters weren't in Washington, D.C. They were in Lansing, the Michigan state capital. That's where I am now. It's actually a beautiful city.
Open the door!
This angry protest, it's not the one that we remember from January 6, 2021. It actually happened 8 months earlier, on 30th of April, 2020. It was a march on the state capitol building of Michigan, not the national one, and in fact there's one other very important difference.
There's plenty of room!
These people didn't smash their way into the Capitol corridors. They were allowed in by the police.
They're letting everybody in, so everybody's get in there.
The police allowed the protesters into the public areas of the State House with their guns. That's permitted under Michigan state law. But they wouldn't allow the protesters into the off-limits areas. And while the protesters shouted a lot, they didn't push past the police. The protest was against Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer's COVID lockdown laws, which were being extended. President Trump had weighed in, tweeting in all caps, "Liberate Michigan." The protesters were accusing Governor Whitmer of being a Nazi.
Heil Hitler, the winner!
Here on the steps of the Capitol, there were speeches given by patriots demanding that the lockdown be lifted, and a little dance done by kids wearing Trump and Obama masks. The whole spectacle was scary for some people, including the politicians inside the building.
Yeah, I see you.
Governor Whitmer described it as disturbing.
Swastikas and Confederate flags, nooses and automatic rifles do not represent who we are as Michiganders.
But the protest was peaceful. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the protesters felt that they had made their point and they went home. There were no injuries and no property was damaged. One man was arrested because he was extremely drunk, but nobody else. 8 months later, President Trump encouraged his supporters to do the same thing that they'd done in Michigan that day and march on the National Capitol building in Washington, D.C.
I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
But it unfolded very differently.
All of them were telling us Trump sent us.
Let's go!
Trump has only asked me for two things. He asked me for my vote, and he asked me to come on January 6th.
People have a lot of different ways of describing what happened on January 6th. A protest, a riot, an attempted coup, an insurrection. Donald Trump has talked about it throughout his campaign for president as a day of love. But even if you don't trust media coverage of that moment in history, even if you think it's been misinterpreted and twisted, just watch the mountains of evidence presented to Congress about that day. And there is no disputing it. Whatever the intention at the start of the day, the attack on the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. was not peaceful.
They're literally calling for the vice president to be effing hung.
We're gonna drag your ass through the streets!
He thinks Mike deserves it. He doesn't think they're doing anything wrong.
We're nice people, but when you treason our country, we'll drag your ass.
The violent mob sang as they hunted the halls for Vice President Mike Pence and Democratic Party Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. 4 years ago, President Donald Trump tried to cling to power. And in the final days of his presidency, his supporters turned to violence to try and keep him there. Trump has been criminally charged for his alleged role in inciting that violence. And now that he's headed back to the White House, there's a chance that the court may never get to decide whether he is guilty of that offence or not. Those cases will presumably be put on hold while he is in the White House. In the face of his extraordinary victory this week, it's tempting to look forwards, and that is important. His second presidency will likely be very different to his first. But the detail of what happened on January 6th and in the months before it is now more important than ever, because the dying days of Trump's first presidency are sure to shape what happens next. It's already fueled his re-election campaign, from the Republican primaries all the way through to his win against Kamala Harris. Denying the 2020 election result didn't keep Donald Trump in the White House, but it helped to ensure that he had a path back there in 2025. So what really happened that day? And what does his win mean for the people who fought for him? I'm Matt Bevan, and from If You're Listening, this is the 4th episode of America's Last Election. So that April protest here in Lansing, Michigan. In the crowd that day was a guy named Dan Chappell, or Big Dan to his friends. Big Dan was an FBI informant hired to infiltrate a local militia group called the Wolverine Watchmen. Militia groups are pretty common in rural Michigan, but this one was a little bit different. While most militias see themselves as preparing for a potential future civil war against the government, the Wolverine Watchmen were actively trying to trigger one.
Why can't our government do what they're supposed to do? Not what they want to do. What they're supposed to do.
Within a few months of the protest at the Michigan Capitol, the Wolverine Watchmen had started plotting to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer. We know this because Big Dan told the FBI about it at the time. He was part of their inner circle, recording the whole thing.
A quick, precise grab on that fucking governor.
A quick, precise grab. As Big Dan watched, the Watchmen started staking out Whitmer's lake house and running training exercises. They were planning to storm the lake house, kidnap the governor, load her onto a boat and take her across Lake Michigan into Wisconsin. There, they would conduct a trial and execute her for treason.
When I put my hand on the Bible and took the oath of office 22 months ago, I knew this job would be hard. But I'll be honest, I never could have imagined anything like this.
The FBI arrested 14 members of the Wolverine Watchmen, beginning a very complicated 4-year process of trying a group of men over a plan that they never carried out. 9 were found guilty and given prison sentences ranging from 3 years probation to 19 years in maximum security prison. The Wolverine Watchmen weren't the only group being monitored, and this sort of violent plotting didn't start with COVID. In mid-2019, the Trump-appointed FBI Director Christopher Wray said far-right domestic terrorism was a rising concern.
The majority of domestic terrorism cases that we've investigated are motivated by some version of what you might call white supremacist violence, but it includes other things as well.
The FBI had placed informants inside several of the far-right Trump-supporting militias. The most prominent of these groups was the Proud Boys, a group that in 2020 had at least several hundred and perhaps several thousand members, depending on whose estimate you believe. The Proud Boys had risen to prominence by clashing violently with Black Lives Matter protesters. In the presidential debate a month before the 2020 election, Trump was asked if he would condemn the Proud Boys for their actions.
Who would you like me to condemn? White supremacists and right Proud Boys, stand back and stand by.
Whatever Trump meant by that comment, it was received by the Proud Boys as an endorsement of their tactics, and they began using it as a recruiting tool. By December 2020, Trump was well aware that groups who supported him had been plotting violent acts, like kidnapping Gretchen Whitmer. He knew that these groups had engaged in street violence and intimidation and promised to fight for him if necessary. Trump knew all of this, and yet on December 18th, at 1:42 in the morning for some reason, he fired off a fateful tweet. Big protest in DC on January 6th. Be there. Will be wild.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
Ever since 1981, US presidents have been inaugurated here on the west terrace of the Capitol building. When they arrive at their inauguration, they walk through a tunnel from the centre of the Capitol building, through a pair of glass doors, and emerge through this arched doorway onto the terrace. I was hoping that I'd be able to get a little bit closer, but police line, do not cross. So there's a set of glass doors, then a few metres more of tunnel, and then the archway. Above the glass doors, there is a security camera. A little after 2 o'clock in the afternoon on January 6, 2021, the camera captures protesters arriving, urged to march on the Capitol by Donald Trump. They were hoping to stop the certification of the presidential election result. If you watch episode 2 of this series, it'll help you understand how exactly they got to this point and what they were trying to do.
I'm just a regular person like everybody else here. It's my building. It's our building.
This was very different to the protest in Michigan. Rather than yell at the police holding the line, the mob tried to bash, smash and push their way through the glass door. They struggled to push the crowd back, with one police officer almost being crushed to death. To stop the crush against the doors, police officers decided to get the crowd out of the tunnel and push them back to the archway.
Push them back!
One of the men they were pushing back on was Albuquerque Head, a Trump supporter from Tennessee with a history of domestic assault and drink driving offences. As the police pushed him and the rest of the crowd out of the tunnel, he noticed that one of the officers had become separated from the formation. Mr. Head put his arm around the officer's neck, looked into the officer's eyes and promised to help him.
I'll help you out here. You hear me? Thank you.
But as he and Officer Michael Fanone were pushed out of the doorway, he turned to the crowd and yelled,
I got one!
I'm not going to show you specifically what happened next because it's honestly just awful. But by the time Officer Fanone was dragged back behind police lines, 3 minutes later, he'd suffered a heart attack, a traumatic brain injury, and a concussion. By now, it was 3:21 p.m. The battle for the tunnel continued to rage, but it didn't matter as much as rioters had found other ways inside the building. You've seen these images before. In fact, I'm sure that they came to your mind the moment that I said January 6th. Men in MAGA hats hanging from the cornices, masses of bodies hazy with tear gas, Confederate flags waving through the mist, a man with horns howling in the hallways, politicians and their staff cowering under the desks. The mob broke into the Capitol through doors and windows, entered the House and Senate chambers, and were hunting the halls for Democratic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Others were promising to hang Vice President Mike Pence, and they'd set up a gallows outside.
If Pence came, we're gonna drag through the streets. Bring it out! Bring out Pence! Bring him out! Bring out Pence! Bring him out! Bring out Pence!
President Donald Trump was safe inside the White House while the violence and chaos of January 6, 2021 unfolded. Throughout the afternoon, he took repeated calls from politicians inside the Capitol building, begging him to send in troops or release a statement asking his supporters to go home. When a staffer told Trump that his vice president was in danger, Trump allegedly said, "So what?" It was more than 2 hours after the Capitol building had been breached that Trump finally released a statement urging his supporters to go home.
So go home. We love you. You're very special. I know how you feel. But go home and go home in peace.
By this stage, dozens of police officers had been injured. One would later die in hospital. 2 protesters were dead. One shot by police, one of a heart attack. The US Justice Department has charged more than 1,400 people with federal crimes related to the attack. More than 900 have been found guilty. Albuquerque Head, the man who grabbed the officer in the tunnel and dragged him away from police lines, was sentenced to more than 7 years in jail. Most of these people weren't part of militia groups like the Proud Boys or the Wolverine Watchmen. A lot of them were just regular Trump supporters who believed what he told them. The election had been stolen, the country had been stolen, and they had to stop it. More than 200 of the people charged with storming the Capitol have said in court filings and statements that they thought they were just doing what Trump wanted them to do. Trump denies any responsibility.
I had nothing to do with that other than they asked me to make a speech. I showed up for a speech.
Federal prosecutors disagree. Trump is one of the 1,400 people charged in connection with the attack. They say Donald Trump knew that his supporters could be violent. He knew they were volatile, and then he pointed them to the Capitol building, hoping to, well, try and convince Mike Pence to play along with the plan, to stop him from certifying the real election result, peacefully and patriotically. When they began acting violently, he left them to their own devices for 187 minutes before asking them to stop. In March 2023, Donald Trump launched his presidential re-election campaign with a rally in the city of Waco, Texas.
President Donald J. Trump!
Before he said a word, he stood to the side of the lectern as an announcement was made.
Ladies and gentlemen, please watch the place for Indepth on the #1 song on iTunes, Amazon, and the Upload charts. Justice for All, featuring Donald J. Trump and the J6 Squad.
What followed was quite an unusual banger. A rendition of the national anthem mixed with Trump reading the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
The national anthem is being sung by the J6 Choir, people serving prison sentences for their involvement in the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. J6, you get it. Trump continued to play the song at campaign events and speeches, and as the campaign went into 2024, he became more explicit about what he thinks about the people locked up for assaulting the Capitol and Capitol Police.
We have people that in many cases are great patriots, great patriots, saying prayers every night, playing our national anthem every day, and they're sitting in a jail nearby, rotting away.
To Trump, the people who were sent to jail for beating Officer Michael Fanone are hostages of the US government. And these hostages are being mistreated.
And being treated so unfairly, like nobody's probably ever been treated in this country before, except maybe me.
In fact, he thinks they're so mistreated that he promised to pardon them if elected.
You would pardon those?
If they're innocent, I would pardon them.
They've been convicted.
And by the way, the Supreme Court just they were convicted by a very tough system.
Regarding the event itself, last month Trump told a Univision town hall event that January 6th was
the day of love.
This isn't a popular position. A poll conducted in January this year indicated that only 26% of Americans think that the sentences given to the J6 hostages were too harsh. So why do this? Why empathise with prisoners that most people think deserve to be locked up? Well, loyalty is important to Donald Trump. He sees these people as loyal followers and therefore he has their back. I don't know if he is really going to pardon them or not. Watch this space next year. But if he does pardon them, if he himself never sees the inside of a courtroom, if his culpability is never tested by the justice system, what does that mean? Does it mean that this is now a legitimate form of political expression? Is beating police officers into hospital while trying to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power now just part of how elections work in America? Is that allowed if your team doesn't win? The period of time we've been looking at between Election Day 2020 and January 6, 2021, it changed things. It's the reason why the second Trump presidency is likely to look a whole lot different from the first. That story is next, in the last chapter of America's last election. Much better when we're not doing it in my basement.
Lemon DC brands. Take one.
One take Matt, that's what they call me.